When a neighborhood Karen called in cops to shut down a lively pool party, no one expected what happened next. But as these so-called officers flashed their badges and barked out orders, one sharp-eyed guest spotted something off, and it wasn't the music. What followed was a shocking takedown of a fake authority scheme, a deep dive into entitlement gone rogue, and a party that ended in handcuffs, just not for who you'd expect. The incident began with what was intended to be a simple neighborhood gathering, an end-of-summer pool party organized by a group of long-term residents. Hosted by the Mitchell family, who had recently renovated their backyard and installed a larger, family-friendly pool, the event was meant to be a positive social affair. The Mitchells had extended open invitations to neighbors, especially families with children, and planned the gathering for a Saturday afternoon to avoid weekday disruptions. Music, light refreshments, and a barbecue were arranged, and everything was conducted within the guidelines established by the Homeowners Association. Leading up to the event, the hosts made efforts to inform immediate neighbors about the gathering. Notices were placed on the community message board, and personal conversations were held with nearby residents to ensure there were no concerns regarding noise or traffic. For most, the event was welcomed as a refreshing change of pace, an opportunity to unwind and build community. However, not everyone was pleased. Karen, a resident known for her frequent complaints and rigid views on neighborhood etiquette, had a long-standing history of opposing any activity that deviated from her sense of order. She had previously filed grievances over children playing outside too loudly, guests parking on the curb in front of her house, and even the height of seasonal lawn decorations. Her interactions with the Mitchells were minimal, but tension existed. She had expressed dissatisfaction with their pool construction, citing alleged violations of noise ordinances and setback rules, even though all permits had been approved by the HOA. In the days before the pool party, Karen made multiple posts in the community forum, cautioning against unauthorized gatherings and vaguely referencing rules about occupancy and disturbance. While most residents dismissed her comments, some noted that her language had become increasingly antagonistic. She had been vocal in asserting that community standards were being eroded by irresponsibility and hinted at taking matters into her own hands if the HOA didn't act. On the day of the party, the event proceeded as planned. Families arrived throughout the afternoon, and the backyard filled with children swimming, adults socializing, and music playing at a moderate volume. By all accounts, the atmosphere remained friendly and respectful. Parking was managed, guests stayed within property boundaries, and no one reported excessive noise or disruptive behavior. Approximately 2 hours into the gathering, a pair of individuals arrived at the Mitchells' property dressed in matching polo shirts and cargo pants. Each wore a badge clipped to their belts and carried official-looking folders. They introduced themselves to a few attendees as members of the Community Enforcement Division and claimed to be acting on behalf of the HOA. According to several witnesses, the men began asking questions about occupancy permits and community use regulations. They also stated that noise complaints had been filed and that the event was in violation of unspecified neighborhood codes. Despite their authoritative tone, many guests were confused by their arrival. No prior mention of a community enforcement division had ever been made by the HOA, and most residents were aware that the association typically followed formal channels for dispute resolution. The men did not carry official HOA identification, nor did they reference any board members by name. Instead, they made vague references to complaints from concerned residents and insisted the party needed to be shut down immediately. When asked to produce official documentation, one of the individuals handed over a paper containing what appeared to be a citation notice. The form lacked the HOA's letterhead, contained several grammatical errors, and listed no contact information for verification. Their behavior grew more aggressive when attendees questioned their authority, with one man threatening fines for noncompliance and claiming that further violations would result in escalated action, including legal intervention. At this point, suspicion began to grow among the guests. Several attendees took photographs of the individuals and the documents they were distributing. One resident quickly checked the HOA website and found no reference to the enforcement body mentioned. Another placed a call to a known board member who confirmed that no enforcement actions were scheduled and that the HOA had not dispatched any personnel. As confusion escalated, it became clear that the arrival of these so-called officers was not a sanctioned visit. More troubling was the realization that their appearance at the event had not been coincidental. It was later revealed that Karen had been observed speaking to one of the men earlier that day near her property. Moreover, she had been seen watching the party from a distance shortly before their arrival, holding her phone in hand and appearing to take photos or video. The sudden intrusion of these impersonators marked the point at which a simple pool party transformed into a neighborhood controversy. The event, which had been entirely peaceful and within all reasonable standards, became the focal point of a much deeper issue: the abuse of power and manipulation of neighborhood dynamics through intimidation and false authority. Karen's pattern of escalating minor concerns had now crossed a significant line. This time, she wasn't just complaining, she was potentially complicit in a coordinated act designed to disrupt and control her neighbors under the guise of enforcement. What began as an afternoon of leisure had now become the spark for a broader investigation into misconduct, deception, and the lengths to which one resident would go to impose her will on the community. The presence of the so-called Community Enforcement Division, members quickly shifted the tone of the pool party from celebratory to skeptical. Though the men attempted to present themselves with authority, their conduct and presentation contained a series of inconsistencies that led many attendees to question the legitimacy of their role. What they lacked in authenticity, they attempted to make up for in tone, firm, commanding, and unyielding, but their act began to unravel under the weight of their own inaccuracies. From the moment they arrived, their appearance stood in stark contrast to what one would expect from official enforcement personnel. Their attire, matching dark polo shirts embroidered with a generic shield icon and labeled said, appeared unprofessional and not representative of any known community authority. Additionally, neither individual wore a body camera, carried identification with a photo, nor displayed a name tag. These absences immediately set off alarms among several attendees familiar with how homeowners associations or local code enforcement typically operate. The badges clipped to their belts resembled cheap novelty reproductions. They were made of thin metal, lacked any department name, and had no serial numbers engraved. Upon closer inspection, the design was inconsistent with official standards, larger than normal, reflective in a way that appeared more decorative than functional, and attached to fake leather holders with no accompanying credentials. To the untrained eye, they might have looked convincing at a glance, but to any resident who had previously interacted with HOA officers or city code personnel, the signs were glaring. Their demeanor added further cause for suspicion. Instead of issuing clear explanations or showing documentation, the men spoke in vague terms. They referred to Section 14 of the community regulations and overcrowding violations, but when asked to clarify which exact rules were being broken, they deflected. They refused to provide the name of the HOA board member who supposedly dispatched them, and when questioned about protocol, they claimed they were empowered to act independently on urgent compliance matters. This explanation contradicted known HOA practices, where even basic citations typically require documentation and formal warnings before enforcement. The documents they distributed were perhaps the most damning. The citation forms appeared to be hastily constructed templates printed on standard office paper. The headers read Community Enforcement Citation, Event Disruption Notice, and contained no official HOA logo or watermark. Fields meant for property address, time of violation, and code reference were inconsistently filled, some with handwriting, others left blank. Notably, the fine amount listed varied from form to form. One resident's slip listed $150, while another's read $275. These inconsistencies made it increasingly clear that the forms were not standardized or approved by any legitimate authority. The citations also contained legal jargon, but much of it was poorly constructed and riddled with typographical errors. Terms like infractions of decibels exceedance, over maximum people capacity allowance, and noncompliance penalty of residence permit had no legal basis and failed to align with any known municipal or HOA codes. The errors and inconsistent phrasing further signaled that the documents had been fabricated with the intention of appearing threatening rather than enforcing actual rules. Beyond the paperwork, the behavior of the enforcers only heightened doubts. When residents began taking photos and asking pointed questions, the men became defensive. They threatened that noncompliance would be reported to county enforcement, but failed to provide any link to county codes or a number to verify their claim. They also warned that future events would result in repeat violations, yet could not explain how such future actions would be monitored or by whom. Rather than calming the crowd with professionalism, their aggressive posture and refusal to engage in transparent communication only fueled suspicion. Another key inconsistency was their lack of transportation. Official personnel often arrive in marked vehicles, especially when performing regulatory duties. These individuals, however, had walked into the property from the end of the street, and no marked vehicle was seen nearby. A few guests noticed them previously loitering near Karen's property, which raised immediate speculation about a prearranged plan. When one resident tried to follow them to see if they would return to a patrol car, the men quickly left the area on foot, offering no explanation. The group's overall approach lacked procedural formality. There was no chain of custody for issuing fines, no carbon copies of citations, no signature lines, and no provided method for appeal or dispute resolution. Residents who had dealt with previous HOA warnings noted that even the mildest infractions, such as misplaced trash bins or unapproved paint colors, came with formal letters and a multi-step process for resolution. The abrupt issuance of citations without dialogue, warning, or written policy references clearly violated every known standard. The most critical turning point came when a resident, an off-duty city clerk, cross-checked the badge designs against a public record database of local enforcement agencies. There was no listing or registration for a community enforcement division within the county, nor were the badge numbers associated with any legitimate agency. This revelation began circulating quickly among attendees, solidifying the belief that these individuals were not just acting without permission, but were outright impersonating authority. This realization dramatically altered the tone of the event. What was initially confusion and discomfort became active concern about fraud, coercion, and the safety implications of having unauthorized individuals presenting themselves as law enforcement. Parents began gathering their children. Others began taking detailed notes, collecting citation forms, and documenting everything with photos and videos. The so-called officers, realizing that the group was growing increasingly organized and skeptical, attempted to leave without further confrontation. However, their hasty exit, coupled with the amount of documentation gathered, ensured that their attempt to intimidate the neighborhood would not go unnoticed or unpunished. What began as a failed attempt to shut down a pool party had now escalated into a suspected case of impersonation, possible fraud, and a community determined to get answers. The layers of deception, from unmarked uniforms to falsified documents, pointed to a broader scheme that required unraveling, and all eyes now turned toward the person believed to be behind it. As the situation continued to unfold, the inconsistencies in the actions and appearance of the so-called Community Enforcement Division began to raise more questions. At first, some attendees hesitated to challenge the men directly, unsure whether they were indeed official representatives of the Homeowners Association. However, as more details came into focus, skepticism quickly grew into a full-blown investigation, with guests becoming increasingly suspicious of the two individuals and their motives. The first significant crack in the men's facade was their badges. To many residents familiar with local law enforcement and HOA regulations, the design and presentation of the badges stood out as problematic. For one, the badges were too large, an anomaly when compared to the official badges worn by genuine HOA officers or local authorities. More critically, they lacked key identifying features such as serial numbers or identifying department logos, which are standard in legitimate identification. The badges were more akin to novelty items one might find in a costume shop, not the type issued to enforcement personnel. Curiosity began to grow, and whispers spread quickly among the guests. Some individuals who had previous experience with local government or law enforcement were the first to identify that the badges were not in line with what they had seen before. When one guest, who happened to be a former city employee, inspected the badges more closely, they noted that the materials were cheaply manufactured. They lacked the typical holograms or other security features used to prevent counterfeiting. As doubts about the badges mounted, attention turned to the enforcers' lack of protocol. Typically, HOA officers or enforcement personnel would present proper identification upon arrival, explain the nature of their authority, and provide details of the specific violation they were addressing. However, these men did none of that. They did not offer an explanation of their purpose other than vague claims about complaints and regulations, and when asked for documentation, they struggled to provide anything legitimate. The citation forms they handed out lacked the typical letterhead or identifiers that would tie them to the HOA or any legitimate authority. They had no contact details for follow-up, no clear pathway for dispute resolution, and no reference to specific sections of the community's rules or city ordinances. The failure to provide even basic documentation suggested that these so-called enforcers were operating without any official sanction. Further complicating the situation was the lack of any marked vehicle. Official enforcement officers would usually arrive in a vehicle that was either marked with the logo of the HOA or equipped with the identifying symbols of local law enforcement. These two individuals, however, were seen walking from the end of the street, far from where any enforcement vehicle might be parked. Their unmarked appearance only added to the confusion. In a tight-knit community where most residents were familiar with one another and the few official vehicles in circulation, the absence of a patrol car or a marked vehicle was immediately suspect. As more residents began to notice these inconsistencies, their skepticism began to grow. The previously silent questions about the authenticity of the men's credentials and authority quickly became more direct and focused. Guests started to discuss the situation openly, comparing notes and observations. The lack of any formal identification, the faulty citation forms, and the absence of a vehicle painted an increasingly clear picture. These men were not legitimate officers of any kind. One guest, a tech-savvy individual with experience in public records, took it upon themselves to investigate the matter further. They quickly searched for information on the HOA's official website, hoping to confirm the presence of a community enforcement division. However, after combing through the site's listings and regulations, they found no mention of such a division. There was no reference to any department by that name, nor did they find any authority figures that matched the descriptions of the men currently at the party. This was the first solid confirmation that these individuals had no connection to the HOA, much less any formal enforcement body. The individual, now convinced that something was amiss, took the next logical step. They contacted a board member of the HOA directly. Within moments, the truth was confirmed. The board member explained that no enforcement officers had been sent to the property, and the HOA had not authorized any such actions. This confirmation sent a ripple through the group, and it became evident that the men were imposters, likely working in coordination with someone else. The realization that the enforcers were fakes quickly spread throughout the party. What had initially been a small group of skeptical individuals turned into a larger network of concerned guests who now recognized the severity of the situation. Some began taking photos of the enforcers, documenting their actions and the citation forms they had distributed. Others started recording videos of the men's behavior, making sure they had undeniable proof of what was happening. A few residents, particularly those with legal or governmental backgrounds, took the initiative to engage the individuals in deeper questioning. They pressed for specifics, demanding to know the official legal basis for their actions, the identity of the complainant, and the exact code violations that had been cited. When the men could not provide clear answers to these questions and became increasingly evasive, the situation escalated. The guests had now shifted from passive observers to active investigators, gathering information that would eventually expose the fraud. As the event progressed, one resident approached the two men and politely but firmly demanded their names and badge numbers. When they failed to provide this information or any real answers, it became abundantly clear that their charade could not continue. By now, the sense of unease had turned into outright alarm. The residents understood that this was no longer a simple misunderstanding or minor dispute. It was an orchestrated attempt to impersonate authority figures and intimidate the community. The situation reached a tipping point when another guest, a local police officer off duty, arrived at the party. Upon being informed of the situation, the officer quickly recognized the fraudulent badges and noted that the men had no legal right to issue citations or enforce any community regulations. It was clear that this was no ordinary pool party disruption. This was an illegal act that warranted immediate attention. By now, what had begun as skepticism had turned into a full-scale investigation, and the guests, armed with the knowledge they had gathered, knew they needed to act. They understood that this wasn't just a matter of questioning authority, it was a matter of protecting their community from deceitful individuals with potentially harmful intentions. The investigation into the fake enforcers would eventually reveal something far more sinister. Karen, the resident who had made numerous complaints against the Mitchells and their pool party, was not just a bystander in this drama, she was deeply involved in orchestrating the entire affair. Her role as the instigator behind the fraudulent enforcement attempt became evident as more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Karen's history with the Mitchell family and their property was marked by a series of complaints and grievances that seemed, at best, petty and, at worst, motivated by personal animosity. When the Mitchells first constructed their pool, Karen had been one of the loudest voices in the neighborhood against the project. She had publicly criticized the construction for its supposed violations of HOA guidelines, despite the fact that the Mitchells had adhered to all necessary permits and zoning laws. Even after the project was approved and completed, Karen continued to express discontent, claiming that the pool's location and design violated community aesthetics and caused unsightly disruptions. Her complaints didn't stop there. She continued to bring up issues that seemed trivial, such as noise from children playing in the pool or the number of guests the Mitchells invited to their gatherings. Karen, who had always prided herself on maintaining an air of authority in the neighborhood, felt personally affronted by what she saw as a disregard for the proper way of living. Her attempts to control the neighborhood dynamics were rooted in a belief that she was entitled to dictate what was acceptable for others. When she couldn't get her way through formal complaints or HOA channels, Karen turned to more drastic and clandestine measures. It became clear that Karen's true motivation was not just a dislike for the Mitchells' pool or their parties, but a broader need for control. Her increasing frustration over the lack of support for her claims from the HOA board, who had repeatedly dismissed her concerns as unfounded, seemed to push her toward more extreme actions. Karen had grown accustomed to wielding influence in the community, whether through passive-aggressive posts on the community board or subtly influencing her neighbors. But when those methods failed, she decided to escalate her efforts in a much more direct manner. After the success of her earlier complaints, Karen started to take matters into her own hands. Her plan to involve the fake enforcers began to take shape well before the pool party took place. Karen, who had been seen speaking with the two imposters on the day of the party, was found to have made multiple phone calls and exchanged several messages with them in the days leading up to the event. It appeared that she had actively coordinated with the men, providing them with the details of the party, the guests attending, and even information about the Mitchells' past disagreements with the HOA. While the specifics of the arrangement between Karen and the impersonators remained unclear for a time, it became evident that she had some degree of involvement in hiring or otherwise enabling them. The men had been seen loitering near her house prior to their arrival at the Mitchells' property, and witness reports later confirmed that Karen had been in close proximity to them on the morning of the party. This connection was further corroborated by photos and videos taken by residents, which showed Karen speaking to the two men before they made their way to the party. Her interactions with them were casual and conspiratorial, indicating that she was not simply a bystander, but an active participant in the scheme. Karen's efforts to frame the Mitchells for violations they didn't commit were part of a larger pattern of behavior that reflected her sense of entitlement and a growing willingness to manipulate others for her own benefit. Over the years, Karen had cultivated a reputation as someone who always sought to impose her personal standards on the neighborhood, often bypassing the established channels for resolution. When things didn't go her way, she resorted to more drastic tactics. The pool party was no different. What made Karen's involvement particularly troubling was the fact that she had relied on deceit and manipulation to achieve her goals. She used the guise of an official HOA enforcement action to intimidate the Mitchells and their guests, fully aware that the men she had hired were not authorized to carry out any kind of enforcement action. The use of fake badges, falsified citation forms, and the aggressive tactics employed by the impersonators were all part of a calculated effort to disrupt the event and force the Mitchells to conform to her perception of what was acceptable. As the truth about Karen's involvement spread, her credibility within the community began to unravel. Neighbors who had once taken her complaints seriously started to question her motives, particularly when they realized that she had gone to such lengths to fabricate a problem that didn't exist. The stark contrast between her public persona and her behind-the-scenes actions made it impossible for her to maintain the facade of a concerned and responsible resident. Her attempt to control the neighborhood through intimidation was seen for what it truly was, a desperate bid for power and influence that bordered on harassment. Karen's reaction to being exposed was predictable. Instead of apologizing or attempting to make amends, she doubled down on her narrative, insisting that she was simply trying to uphold the standards of the community. However, her efforts to deflect blame only alienated her further. As more residents came forward with evidence of her involvement, it became clear that her actions were not only unethical, but possibly illegal. The HOA board, now fully aware of the situation, began looking into potential legal action against Karen, as well as the two impersonators. The fallout from Karen's exposure extended beyond the immediate pool party incident. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked entitlement and the lengths some people are willing to go to enforce their version of order. The Mitchells, who had been caught in the crossfire of Karen's vendetta, were not only vindicated but also received an outpouring of support from the community. The incident served as a reminder that while a single individual may try to impose their will through manipulation, a united community can stand up against deceit and abuse of power. The aftermath of Karen's actions marked a significant turning point not only for Mitchell family, but for the entire neighborhood. As the truth about the fake enforcers came to light and Karen's role in orchestrating the incident was exposed, the situation escalated from a simple neighborhood dispute to a matter of legal and civic importance. The consequences of her actions would reverberate throughout the community, resulting in serious legal repercussions for her and a renewed sense of unity among the residents. Once the fake enforcers had been identified as imposters, the residents were quick to contact local law enforcement. The off-duty police officer who had attended the party immediately took the lead in reporting the incident to the appropriate authorities. The Mitchells, realizing the severity of the situation, cooperated fully with the investigation, providing all the evidence they had gathered, including photos, videos, and the fraudulent citations that had been distributed. The gathering of evidence was critical, as it not only proved that Karen's scheme had been carried out with malicious intent, but it also provided concrete proof that the men who had arrived at the party were impersonating law enforcement officers. Law enforcement quickly began their investigation, and the first step was to track down the two imposters. They were arrested shortly after, charged with impersonating public officers, fraud, and attempted extortion. The two men, it turned out, were not associated with any community enforcement agency, and their involvement in the scheme was a blatant attempt to intimidate residents into compliance. Though the men had initially tried to appear official, their lack of credentials, inconsistent stories, and forged documents left little room for doubt about their intentions. The police also discovered a trail of communication between Karen and the imposters, further solidifying her role in the scheme. Karen had not only provided the details of the Mitchells' pool party, but had also instructed the men on what violations to target. This evidence led to the filing of charges against Karen for conspiracy to commit fraud, harassment, and abuse of power. Her actions were considered a direct attempt to manipulate the HOA's rules and intimidate her neighbors into submitting to her personal agenda. Karen's involvement in the scheme was seen as a deliberate and malicious attempt to control the community through deceit and intimidation. Once charges were filed, the community's response to Karen's actions was swift and decisive. Initially, many neighbors had sympathized with her complaints about the Mitchells' pool and other community matters, believing that she was simply a concerned resident looking out for the neighborhood's best interests. However, as the details of her plot came to light, the mood quickly shifted. Karen's actions were viewed as a betrayal of the trust that neighbors had placed in her. What had once been perceived as legitimate concerns now seemed like the desperate attempts of an individual using her position to bully others for personal gain. The support that had once been directed toward Karen quickly evaporated, replaced by anger and disbelief. Her manipulation of the situation not only caused distress for the Mitchells, but also threatened to undermine the integrity of the entire neighborhood. In the face of this, many residents began to speak out in support of the Mitchells, rallying together to show that such behavior would not be tolerated. The Mitchells, who had initially been on the defensive, found themselves surrounded by a community eager to stand with them. The neighborhood came together in a show of solidarity, with neighbors publicly condemning Karen's actions and making it clear that they would not allow one individual to dictate the rules of the community. This collective response was a testament to the strength of the neighborhood spirit. The community rejected the idea of one person using fake authority to impose their will, and they rallied behind the idea of upholding fairness and transparency. In the weeks following the incident, a series of community meetings were organized to address the issue of authority and power within the neighborhood. These meetings became a platform for residents to discuss ways to ensure that such an event would never happen again. The HOA board, now under greater scrutiny, was forced to revise its communication processes, making it clear that only authorized personnel could issue fines or conduct enforcement actions. A new policy was established to better define the roles and responsibilities of those involved in neighborhood regulations, ensuring that any enforcement actions would be transparent, documented, and legitimate. The HOA also worked with local law enforcement to provide additional training for residents about how to identify legitimate enforcement personnel and how to report suspicious activity. The incident served as a wake-up call for the entire community, highlighting the need for vigilance and awareness when it came to matters of authority. Karen, on the other hand, faced significant legal consequences. The charges against her, including conspiracy and harassment, carried serious penalties. As her actions were examined in court, it became clear that her need for control had crossed a line, and the legal system was determined to hold her accountable. Her trial became a focal point for the community, and it was clear that she had lost the support of nearly everyone in the neighborhood. The once privileged position she held as a self-proclaimed community leader was effectively dismantled. As the legal process moved forward, Karen was eventually convicted on several charges, including conspiracy and fraud. Her sentence included fines, mandatory community service, and a period of probation. The conviction served as a reminder to the community that actions driven by personal vendettas and abuse of power would not go unpunished. It also sent a broader message about the importance of standing up against fake authority and fraudulent attempts to manipulate the system. The Mitchells, meanwhile, found themselves not only exonerated, but also with a newfound sense of solidarity from their neighbors. Their party, initially targeted as the source of controversy, became a symbol of resistance against abuse of power. What was meant to be an isolated social gathering turned into a defining moment in the fight against bullying and false authority. The support they received from the community helped them to recover from the distress caused by Karen's actions and reinforce their belief in the importance of standing up for what is right. The incident ultimately united the neighborhood in a way that few other events could have. Residents, once divided by small issues and personal differences, came together to protect one another from manipulation and injustice. The lesson learned was clear. When a community stands united, even the most powerful attempts at control and intimidation can be thwarted. In the end, Karen's plan had completely backfired. Far from achieving her goal of silencing the Mitchells, she had exposed herself as a fraud, and in doing so, strengthened the bonds between the residents. The community learned that when faced with fake authority and harassment, the best course of action was not to back down, but to come together, support one another, and fight for what was just. Stay informed and join us for more shocking stories. Subscribe to expect stories for the latest updates.